The project management cycle. What is the project life cycle? One of the first understandings that we need to have in this course is that there's a difference between the project life cycle and the project management life cycle. We're going to look first at the project life cycle, and it usually consists of three major phases. There is a design phase where you design all the elements of the project, the monitoring phase, and the evaluation phase. This is usually known as the design, monitoring, and evaluation cycle of the project. Within that cycle, we identify these other elements. There is the concept or idea, the design, the planning, the monitoring, evaluation, and learning. That is usually what most of the project life cycles that are related to development projects. And one thing that we know is that those three main phases of the project are usually managed by different groups of people. So in the design, the proposal and the funding will usually be managed by a group of people within the organization. Then the implementation, the monitoring of the project is usually managed by the project manager and the team. And then we have the final phase of the evaluation on even the audit, usually led by different people. So what we're going to concentrate now is on this phase, when the project manager is leading and managing a project. And this is our graphic of the project management life cycle. And it consists of 6 phases. There is an initiation phase that begins once the project is being approved and the donor is approving and has signed the contract, and the organization has appointed a project manager. So the project management life cycle begins once there is a project manager and a project team. Then is a planning phase where most of the project management plans are developed. Then most of the work happens during the implementation. Then we have a monitoring phase, an adapting phase, and a closing phase. That means that your project from beginning to end will have a beginning and an end, and in between we have this cycle, a continuous cycle of plan, implement, monitor, adapt, and then plan. And that is a key characteristic of project management life cycle, that because of the difficulties that we know that exist in development project, the uncertainty of development projects, is that the idea to create this cycle to help manage projects that in many cases are very complex. These phases also overlap over time. So from the beginning of your project all the way to the end, you're going to see the different level of effort each one of these phases do. Here's a specific characteristic that look at planning phase, and we can see it has a lot of effort and contains a lot of time within the project lifetime. The biggest amount of work will happen in our implementation, where most of the effort and resources will be used. But it's good to understand that there's always this overlap between those phases. And we'll understand that later in the course, the meaning of those overlaps. But what is important is to understand that the planning phase, once you are, for example, right here, that could be the moment when you complete all your plans. But the action of planning also includes the process of adapting, modifying, and improving your plans that usually happen within this area. Let's look at another example. The project cycles over time. The idea is that because of the uncertainty of development projects, those complex projects, the best approach is to break them down into cycles. Those cycles could be time periods, 6 months, 1 year, depending on the project. But the idea of cycles is that you go through all those phases. You begin in your first cycle, you start the project, you do some planning, implement, you monitor, adapt, and then you close that phase. What happens during that cycle is that there was a lot of learning. You notice that the original plans, that the ideas that you had on how you're going to manage your project had to be modified, or they need to change for the next cycle. And that's part of the lessons that the project learns in that cycle. They can be incorporated into the next cycle. So when you begin the next cycle, you go to the same process, you plan again, you implement, you monitor, you adapt, and then you close it. And you again, gain more knowledge. You gain more experience. Your team is more aware about the conditions and the context, the internal and external environment, and how they are impacting your project and making those changes that need to happen, so that it's much easier. Now in your third cycle, you continue with that process again, and you build on all the experience and all that knowledge you were able to capture in the cycles 1 and cycles 2, and it makes it easier. Again, depending on the type of project, the length of the project, the cost and complexities, you might have more cycles, less cycles, and each one of those phases will require more or less time. But the idea behind that, the project management cycle, and the idea of this continuous improvement process, is that it helps us manage uncertainty. The idea is that development projects will always face challenges. There are going to be risks. There are going to be situations where the project manager and the team, they need to make changes because the conditions have changed in the field. Whatever was planned or designed at the beginning, the conditions that they find 1 year later or 6 months later change. So there's a need to adapt. There's a need to make changes and improvements in the next cycle. If the projects were simple, if the projects didn't have any complex, or it was completely certainty, then we didn't need to have that cycle. Our project will just be linear. But the idea is that this cycle brings in those skills and that knowledge that can help us manage that uncertainty.